What I'm going to do is kind of continue this analysis of biosecurity, which we've been hearing about in the last two presentations. But I'm a social scientist. I'm one of those people who get excited when I hear Ian Boyd talk and say that TB is a sociological problem, not an epidemiological problem. So I'm going to talk a bit more about and pay more attention to the social practices and the processes and the social histories around biosecurity and how those have informed TB eradication programs. Now, there's a fair amount of social science in the UK around farmers' behaviour, around vets' behaviour, around what government does and how what government does influences what farmers do. I'm not going to talk about that. If you want to talk to me about it, come and find me afterwards. What I am going to do is talk a little bit about New Zealand and the relevance of New Zealand to TB control in the UK. So I'm going to start off just by this simple recognition that New Zealand really are the best at everything that has ever been invented. Look at these scores. The next one's good because you can see, if you know rugby, that Wales has scored 2 tries against New Zealand, and that's better than just scoring penalties. These are not rugby scores, because if they were, there would be one up there which said New Zealand 40 and England 113. Now, as a Welshman, I couldn't bear to put that up there. That's never going to happen. England aren't going to beat New Zealand again. That's right, isn't it? These are actually mentions of New Zealand and those other countries in DEFRA's TB eradication strategy from a couple of years ago. So what we've got then is this kind of emerging narrative or mythology that New Zealand is a kind of a policy leader of TB policy. If you spoke to Australians, they might disagree with you there. Obviously, Australia have eradicated TB. New Zealand is still in the kind of final process of it. But we look at New Zealand, we think, yeah, we need to do what they're doing. And I'm interested in why that actually happens. Part of it, I think, is down to the ways in which New Zealand have approached managing TB, recognising that TB is a social and a behavioural issue, that governance is really important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think we're still a little way behind that, although Ian Boyd mentioned this morning, like I just said a minute ago, that TB is a sociological problem. If you look at the list of people speaking today, you can see how those kind of reflect how TB is framed as a scientific and epidemiological problem. What I want to do then in the time I've got is just tell kind of 3 stories or 3 vignettes of the history of TB in New Zealand and how it was controlled, and think about what we can actually learn from those stories. Some of which perhaps we already have learned. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is education. I want to think about how New Zealand policymakers have tried to educate or seen education of farmers as really vital to their TB programme, particularly around how TB is transmitted and diagnostics. And the point I want to make really is that New Zealand really suffered from the same problems that we suffer from now in trying to convince people that the science is right. You just need to kind of listen to what scientists say and everything will be okay. And I want to talk a little bit about that and say, well, actually, maybe we need to actually learn from how New Zealand kind of recovered from that and think about doing science in a slightly different way. So back in the 1950s, when New Zealand started to think about TB eradication, one of the things they produced was this leaflet talking about how education of the farming community is the first step in any scheme of the elimination of bovine tuberculosis. One of the problems which they faced when they started trying to eradicate TB was the fact that loads and loads of farms were going down with TB in a serious way. And farmers were getting really frustrated by the control programme. So much so that they went on strike. They refused to test. In the 1960s on the West Coast, on the South Island, they basically said, we're not going to test anymore because this is just out of control. What you're doing is you're decimating our businesses and we won't allow that to happen. They were egged on by local vets as well, who were in kind of dispute with the Department of Agricultural Department of Agriculture vets. That's another story, which I won't go into too much. It's an interesting story. But they went on strike. How did the Department of Agriculture respond to that? Well, they responded to it in the similar way in which we've seen the UK respond to these kind of problems. When farmers said we want proof on how accurate these TB tests actually are, what they did was they organised a trial. So at Flock House, one of the agricultural colleges just outside Bulls on the North Island, in the early 1960s, they railroaded 500 odd cows in from around the country, subjected them to a battery of different TB tests, killed them, and then looked inside to see whether they had TB, whether they could find lesions. That was their answer. If only we could find, if we can get the science and we can tell farmers what the actual proof is, then we'll be okay, and they'll believe us, and we'll go back to testing properly. Didn't really work like that. When the results came out, the Department of Agriculture were actually quite happy with the results and said, well, actually, this confirms what we've believed all along, that the tests were accurate. Other people looked, because all tests aren't 100%, they're not perfect. Other people picked kind of holes and said, well, actually, innocent cows are still dying. These tests still are a problem. So, what's the lesson from that? The first lesson really is that these are quite familiar problems. This is happening 50 years ago. We still hear those conversations now here, and also in New Zealand. To what extent, then, can we rely on this kind of top-down scientific mode of communicating, treating people that if only they know the answers, if only we can give them facts, then they'll do as we want them to? Well, it doesn't really work very well. And maybe we need to start to find other ways of having a conversation, having a dialogue with people about these tricky issues, and doing science in a different way. We'll come on to that as well in the third lesson. Okay, so you've heard already from Amy a little bit about risk-based trading. I want to talk about the origins of risk-based trading in New Zealand and think about what we can learn from what happened in New Zealand. And perhaps the question is not what is the right measures of risk-based trading, but what is the kind of social context? What do you need? What are the social ingredients in order for a risk-based trading system to actually work? Amy kind of hinted a little bit about that at the end of her presentation, talking about trust. I'm going to talk about that now. So, what is the origins in New Zealand? I think you need to kind of go back to the early 60s when the eradication program was first starting there. Although it was a very kind of paternalistic, top-down approach, there were some interesting things done at the very, very start. One of those things was setting up what were known then as regional animal health advisory committees. The first job these committees had, and they were made up of farmers, was to decide who got compensation for TB breakdown. Not the government, but farmers looked at other farmers' cases and decided who, and they called them hardship payments, who was going to get that money. So those were set up 50, 60 years ago, and they've continued right through the TB eradication program in New Zealand. Now, in the 1990s, when there were a lot of things going on in New Zealand, not just around TB, TB was on the rise, and certain people in certain parts of the country were getting quite concerned. One of those people was Ray Bramall, here in this picture. Ray Bramall was an auctioneer in the Hawke's Bay on the east coast on the North Island. And other farmers as well, became really concerned about the number of animals coming in from areas that had high levels of TB. They were concerned that those were bringing TB into the area. He was the chair of the Regional Animal Health Committee and decided to do something about it, along with other farmers. And this was quite a big risk for him doing this, particularly in his role as an auctioneer. Basically what he said was any animal going to be sold in the Hawke's Bay area has to complete, or the farmers have to complete one of these identification cards, these status declaration cards. And they had to be kind of hung on the side of the pen in the market. So this was the first kind of attempt to create this kind of risk-based trading system. Gradually, that system became adopted by the Animal Health Board, which was set up in 1998, and became what was known as C status. Now, every herd in New Zealand is ranked from 1 to 10. C1 means they've been clear of TB for 1 year. C10 means you've been clear for 10 years. You can't go any higher than 10. If you have been higher than 10, you're still called C10. If you're infected, you have an infected status, I1, 2, 3, whatever it is. So this starts to create a kind of a system of status. There are good farmers who are clean of TB. And there's a system of incentivisation as well, so that if you are C10 and you buy some cattle from a herd, how many? Three. God. Which is only C3, then you could move down that system. Okay, so this is all about trying to create the idea of a good farmer and create some kind of incentive to change behaviour. Now, I've done some work looking at the extent to which that actually happens, and there are some factors which mean that it doesn't really have much influence. Farmers living and working in high-risk areas see TB as a matter of luck. It doesn't really influence what they do. They're not going to move away from a particular area, so status doesn't help them sell their cattle in that sense. They're always going to be in that place. Whereas farmers in low-risk areas also see C10, a high status, as also being quite accidental. A farmer's not done anything to deserve that reward. So there are some kind of problems in trying to create status through risk-based trading and change people's farmers. But every farmer in New Zealand knows what score they are. They know whether they're C2, C3, C4, C5. And the other thing to remember about this is, if I just go back, this C1 to C10 status, well, the vets in the Animal Health Board weren't actually that keen on that. They just thought there are about 2 levels of risk. We only need to do 2 levels of risk, C1 and C2, for example. Actually, farmers said, no, we like this score. We want to keep this 10-point system. So they did. And that leads on to the third question, or the third issue. And that is this kind of top-down system of governance. Now, in the 1960s, Sam Jameson, a Scottish guy actually, was the chief vet in New Zealand. He took this very kind of paternalistic attitude that what he said was right. This is him talking to a farmer, basically dismissing his ideas. What happened after he left, though, was a different breed of vets came in. And what they did was started to listen to farmers, become affected by their own kind of personal stories, because they weren't governing and doing their work from Wellington. They were actually living amongst those farmers. And they started to combine farmers' data and farmers' experiences with their own veterinary epidemiological training, and in effect creating a new kind of epidemiology, a new kind of science. They realised that if you go too far one side, then you lose the farming community, and you had to strike that fine balance, that there was no kind of silver bullet. It was always kind of managing a fine balance, and that's difficult. Okay? So flexibility, accommodation is this kind of key kind of lesson from that aspect of governance, that we need to find ways of co-constructing approaches to TB management rather than imposing them. So I'll just leave you with this quote. This quote could be from and about and by farmers living in the southwest. Certainly it's a kind of an idea which comes through from a lot of my research, talking to farmers down there in West Wales as well. It's not. It's a quote from farmers on the west coast of New Zealand in the 1960s, talking about how they feel they've been abandoned. And I guess for me as a social scientist, what I would say is that's what needs to be addressed within TB management, how you get two sides to talk and work together. That's it.